They've led with grace, inspired with style, and, believe it or not, left their mark with their favorite meals. Whether sweet or savory, these dishes reveal the untold stories of America's most iconic women. Ready to see what they couldn't resist? Long before the White House even had a kitchen, Martha Washington set the standard for hospitality in early America. She understood that food wasn't just sustenance, it was a statement. As the nation's First Lady, she hosted elaborate gatherings at Mount Vernon, where one dish in particular was a favorite: crab soup. A rich, creamy staple of Chesapeake cuisine, it reflected both her Virginia roots and the region's abundant seafood. While her husband dealt with the country's future, she ensured their table celebrated its present. Even today, versions of her beloved crab soup remain a signature of Southern cooking. While Abigail Adams's husband shaped a young nation, she managed their home, advised him in letters, and even ran their family farm. Practical and no-nonsense, she preferred simple, hearty dishes over extravagant fare. One dessert she loved was apple pan dowdy, a baked apple dish sweetened with molasses and topped with a crumbly crust. Unlike the refined French pastries that would later grace White House tables, this was pure New England comfort food. Even its name suggests humility. But make no mistake, this dish, much like Abigail herself, was built to last. Martha Jefferson Randolph was official White House hostess, stepping in for her late mother during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Educated in Paris, she had an appreciation for French cuisine, but at Monticello, she favored a dish that blended European refinement with Southern tradition: chicken fricassee. A slow-cooked stew with tender chicken in a creamy, wine-infused sauce, it was a staple of Virginia kitchens and a reminder of the Jeffersons' French influence. Unlike the politics of the time, it was rich, smooth, and comforting, qualities that likely made it a welcome sight at any Jefferson dinner table. If there was ever a First Lady who knew how to throw a party, it was Dolly Madison. Famous for her lavish White House receptions, she made sure guests were treated to the finest foods of the time. But one indulgence stood out: her love for homemade strawberry ice cream. Long before refrigeration, making ice cream was no small task. Yet Dolly served it regularly at social gatherings, delighting Washington's elite. She didn't just save Washington's portrait during the War of 1812, she also saved America's reputation for hospitality. If diplomacy had a flavor, in her White House, it was strawberry. Elizabeth Monroe brought an air of European sophistication to the White House, but behind the formality was a woman with a love for simple pleasures. Among them were cream jumbles, a soft, lightly sweetened cookie made with cream and a hint of spice. Unlike the elaborate French pastries she encountered while living abroad, this was a familiar, comforting treat. Monroe, often compared to Dolly Madison for her quieter social presence, may not have been the life of the party, but she certainly knew the value of a good cookie. After all, diplomacy is important, but so is having something to dunk in your tea. Louisa Adams was the only First Lady born outside the United States, and her worldly background was reflected in her tastes. Raised in England and well-traveled through Europe, she developed an appreciation for refined, complex flavors. One dish she particularly enjoyed was turtle soup, a delicacy in both British and American high society. This rich, savory broth was a staple at elite banquets, symbolizing sophistication and wealth. While her husband, John Quincy Adams, was navigating political battles, Louisa was hosting diplomatic dinners where turtle soup made frequent appearances. Emily Donaldson stepped into the role of First Lady at just 21, serving as Andrew Jackson's White House hostess after the death of his wife. Despite the political turbulence of Jackson's presidency, she brought grace and refinement to the executive mansion. And before I uncover her favorite dish, it seems as though this particular dish was quite popular at the time because it was also Sarah Jackson's favorite. Taking on the role after Emily fell ill, Sarah embraced the elegance of Southern hospitality, ensuring that dinners remained as refined as ever. Their favorite dessert was Floating Island, a delicate French-inspired treat featuring meringue islands atop a pool of silky custard. Elegant yet uncomplicated, it was a favorite among 19th century elites. Given the heated debates swirling around Jackson's administration, a dessert that looked like it was peacefully drifting might have been the closest thing to calm in the White House. When Angelica Van Buren took over White House hostess duties for her widowed father-in-law, she brought a youthful energy and European-inspired elegance to Washington. But despite her refined tastes, one of her favorite dishes was deeply rooted in her family's Dutch heritage: apple cake. A nod to Martin Van Buren's New York upbringing, this spiced, fruit-filled dessert reflected the Dutch influence on early American baking. Served warm and often topped with cream, it was the kind of comfort food that made even the most formal state dinners feel a little more like home. In a politically divided era, at least dessert wasn't up for debate. Letitia Tyler may have been the First Lady to live in the White House, but she preferred the comforts of her Virginia roots. Raised on a plantation, she had a deep appreciation for Southern traditions, including its food. One dish that stood out was Virginia peanut soup, a rich, velvety blend of roasted peanuts, broth, and spices. Though Letitia's time as First Lady was brief due to illness, her legacy, like the dish she loved, was one of quiet strength and unmistakable Southern flavor. Priscilla Tyler was a dynamic White House hostess, stepping in after Letitia Tyler's passing. Unlike her predecessor's reserved nature, Priscilla thrived in Washington's social circles, bringing energy and charm to official gatherings. Her Southern roots were reflected in the dishes she enjoyed, particularly molasses cake. A staple of 19th century Southern kitchens, this rich, spiced dessert was affordable, flavorful, and easy to make in large batches, perfect for entertaining. While politics in the Tyler White House may have been unpredictable, guests could at least count on one thing: dessert was always served with Southern hospitality. Julia Tyler knew how to make an entrance. As the First Lady to have "Hail to the Chief" played for the president, she embraced the spotlight and brought glamour to the White House. While records of her favorite dishes are scarce, oysters were a known delicacy of the era and popular in high society, making them a likely feature on her table. Whether served fried, stewed, or raw, they were the kind of dish that matched Julia's style. Luxurious, attention-grabbing, and always fit for a grand occasion. Sarah Polk ran the White House with discipline. No dancing, no hard liquor, and absolutely no frivolous spending. But even the strictest First Lady had her indulgences, and for Sarah, that was hickory nut cake. A delicacy of the time, this spiced, nut-filled dessert reflected her Tennessee roots, where hickory trees were plentiful. Unlike the extravagant French pastries favored by later First Ladies, this cake was humble yet flavorful, much like Sarah herself. Known for advising her husband on political matters, she ensured the White House stayed efficient. Margaret Taylor never wanted the spotlight. After decades of following her husband, Zachary Taylor, through military outposts, she preferred a quiet life over Washington's social scene. But her Southern heritage shined through in the foods she enjoyed, including bourbon-glazed pecans, a sweet, spiced treat with a touch of Kentucky's famous spirit. Pecans were a staple in the South, and with a drizzle of bourbon, they became a true regional delicacy. While Margaret avoided public events, she was known for her warmth in private gatherings. And let's be honest, when bourbon and sugar are involved, making guests feel welcome isn't too difficult. Abigail Fillmore was a former school teacher with a love for literature and tradition. While she championed education by helping establish the first White House library, her tastes in food remained deeply rooted in her New England upbringing. Indian pudding, a slow-cooked blend of cornmeal, molasses, and spices, was a staple of colonial America and one of her favorite desserts. Originally inspired by Native American cooking, it became a New England classic. Much like Abigail herself, this dish was understated but enduring, a warm, comforting reminder of the past in a rapidly changing nation. Jane Pierce was never comfortable in the role of First Lady. Shy, deeply religious, and devastated by personal tragedies, she avoided Washington's social scene whenever possible. But when it came to food, her New England roots remained strong. A traditional boiled dinner, Corned beef, slow-cooked with potatoes, cabbage, and root vegetables, was a staple of the region and a dish she likely found comforting. Simple, hearty, and practical, it reflected the no-frills sensibility of 19th century New England. While Jane may have preferred a quiet life away from politics, one thing was certain. In her household, home-cooked meals were never up for debate. As the niece of Bachelor President James Buchanan, Harriet Lane took on the role of White House hostess and quickly became a national celebrity. Her charm and sense of style captivated the public, but when it came to food, she kept things refreshingly simple. Strawberry shortcake, a sweet layered dessert of biscuits, berries, and cream, was a favorite. During the mid-19th century, strawberries symbolized luxury and freshness, making the dessert a highlight of elegant gatherings. Much like Harriet herself, it was bright, crowd-pleasing, and left a lasting impression. Mary Todd Lincoln had a taste for the finer things, and that extended to her favorite dessert, white almond cake. A rich, elegant confection made with finely ground almonds and egg whites. It was a popular choice for special occasions, including Abraham Lincoln's inaugural reception. Unlike the turbulent years of the Civil War, this cake was smooth, delicate, and well-balanced. Everything Mary wished Washington politics could be. Known for her extravagant White House entertaining, she appreciated foods that impressed. And while her husband was famous for his humble appetite, when it came to dessert, even Honest Abe wouldn't turn down a slice. Eliza Johnson preferred the quiet work behind the scenes, avoiding Washington's social spotlight whenever possible. As First Lady, she focused on keeping the White House running smoothly while battling lifelong health issues. But if there was one thing that embodied her Tennessee roots, it was sweet potato biscuits. A staple of Southern kitchens, these tender, slightly sweet biscuits were both practical and comforting, just like Eliza herself. Sweet potatoes were abundant and affordable, making them a favorite ingredient in post-Civil War America. While her husband struggled with Reconstruction, at least in her home, there was one thing that always held together: the biscuits. Julia Grant embraced life in the White House with enthusiasm, bringing warmth and elegance to an era defined by post-war recovery. She had a taste for the finer things, and one of the most luxurious dishes of the time, terrapin stew, was among her favorites. A rich, sherry-infused delicacy made from turtle meat, it was a staple at high society banquets. In the 19th century, terrapin was considered a status symbol, and Julia's lavish White House entertaining made sure it was on the menu. While her husband was known for battlefield grit, Julia preferred something a little more refined, especially when served with style. Lucy Hayes made history as the First Lady with a college degree, but she's best remembered for banning alcohol from the White House, earning her the nickname Lemonade Lucy. While guests had to settle for temperance-friendly beverages, they could at least enjoy her love for homemade crumpets. A nod to her English ancestry, these soft, griddle-cooked breads were perfect for breakfast or afternoon tea. Crumpets were simple, but they fit her warm and welcoming style. While some guests may have wished for a stronger drink, at least they had something hearty to soak up their disappointment, preferably with plenty of butter. Lucretia Garfield was an intellectual, an artist, and a devoted wife, but her time as First Lady was tragically short, just a few months before President Garfield was shot. Even during her brief tenure, she brought warmth to the White House, much like her favorite comfort food, potato bread. A staple in 19th century kitchens, this hearty, soft bread made use of leftover potatoes, a frugal yet delicious way to stretch ingredients. Lucretia, known for her practicality and resilience, likely appreciated its simplicity. While history remembers her for enduring a national tragedy, in her home, simple, wholesome food always had a place. Mary Arthur McElroy wasn't a president's wife. She was his sister. When Chester A. Arthur entered the White House as a widower, she stepped in as First Lady, managing social events with quiet confidence. Raised in upstate New York, she had a taste for simple, hearty dishes, and corn fritters were a particular favorite. A staple of 19th century American cooking, these crispy, golden bites reflected the agricultural abundance of the era. Whether served sweet or savory, they were as versatile as Mary herself. Graceful in Washington society, but always grounded in her small-town roots. Rose Cleveland had no intention of being First Lady, but when her bachelor brother, Grover Cleveland, took office, duty called. Independent and highly educated, she preferred philosophy books over White House banquets. But one simple pleasure she did enjoy was maple sugar candies, a classic treat in her home state of New York. Made by boiling down pure maple sap, these melt-in-your-mouth sweets were a beloved New England tradition. While Rose's time in Washington was brief, she left a lasting impression. Frances Cleveland was the youngest First Lady in history, stepping into the White House at just 21. Beloved by the public, she brought elegance and charm to Washington, and her refined tastes extended to desserts. One of her favorites was Charlotte Russe, a French-inspired creation of sponge cake and whipped cream, often served chilled in decorative molds. In the Gilded Age, this dessert was the height of sophistication, much like Frances herself. While her husband served 2 non-consecutive terms, Frances remained a steady presence, proving that whether in politics or dessert, some classics never go out of style. Caroline Harrison was a modernizer. As First Lady, she spearheaded White House renovations, introduced electricity, and even helped catalog the mansion's historic china collection. But when it came to food, she appreciated timeless flavors, like deviled almonds. A popular Victorian-era snack, these spiced roasted nuts were often served at elegant receptions. Almonds symbolized refinement, and with a kick of seasoning, they made for an irresistible bite. Caroline's White House was one of progress, but some traditions, like offering guests a well-seasoned treat, never changed. Mary McKee wasn't a traditional First Lady. She was the daughter of President Benjamin Harrison, stepping in as White House hostess after her mother's passing. While she carried out her duties with grace, she preferred the comforts of home, and few things were more nostalgic than gingerbread. A staple in 19th century American kitchens, this spiced, molasses-rich treat was both simple and deeply flavorful. It was the kind of dessert that evoked warmth, especially in a household that had seen its share of loss. Ida McKinley's time as First Lady was marked by quiet strength. Suffering from chronic illness, she often remained seated during official events, but her husband's devotion ensured she was never sidelined. One dish she favored was chicken salad, a light yet satisfying meal that suited her delicate health. By the late 19th century, chicken salad had become a fashionable dish, served at luncheons and afternoon teas. Blended with mayonnaise, herbs, and sometimes grapes or nuts, it was both practical and refined. While William McKinley led the nation, Ida's White House table proved that even the simplest meals could be elegant. Edith Roosevelt was a master of order. She expanded the White House, established a structured social calendar, and ensured Theodore Roosevelt's lively household of 6 children ran smoothly. But when it came to food, her tastes were refreshingly simple. Cornmeal mush, a humble dish made by boiling cornmeal into a porridge, was a favorite. A staple of early American kitchens, it was inexpensive, filling, and could be dressed up with butter or molasses. In a house full of Rough Riders and rambunctious kids, Edith knew the value of a meal that kept everyone grounded. Helen Taft had a taste for both power and refinement. The only First Lady to ride with her husband in the inaugural parade, she was deeply involved in politics and White House affairs. But when it came to food, she favored the finer things, like turtle soup, a delicacy that had long been a symbol of luxury. Served at high-end banquets, this rich, sherry-laced dish was a staple of Washington's elite dining scene. While her husband became famous for his appetite, Helen had her own indulgences. And in an era when appearances mattered, nothing said sophistication quite like a bowl of turtle soup. Ellen Wilson brought Southern grace to the White House, but her time as First Lady was tragically short. A Georgia native, she had a deep appreciation for the region's cuisine, and nothing was more iconic than fried chicken. Crisp, golden, and seasoned to perfection. It was a staple of Southern hospitality. While she focused much of her efforts on social reform, advocating for better housing in Washington, she also valued the comforts of home. Edith Wilson was, in many ways, the unofficial president. After Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke, she quietly took on a leadership role, managing his correspondence and shielding him from political pressures. But despite her power behind the scenes, her tastes were simple, and cornbread was a longtime favorite. A Southern staple, this golden, buttery bread was a symbol of resilience, much like Edith herself. Whether served with honey or crumbled into soup, cornbread was both practical and comforting. And in a White House where decisions were quietly being made, at least the bread stayed warm and familiar. Florence Harding was no stranger to hard work. A former newspaper publisher, she played a key role in her husband's political career, shaping his image and managing his schedule. But behind the scenes, she had a love for hearty, comforting meals, and chicken pot pie was a personal favorite. A dish as practical as it was delicious, it was a staple in early 20th century kitchens, combining flaky pastry with rich, savory filling. Florence, known for her strong will and sharp instincts, appreciated meals that were both satisfying and reliable. Grace Coolidge brought warmth and charm to a presidency defined by her husband's quiet, reserved nature. A Vermont native, she had a deep appreciation for the region's most famous export, maple syrup. One of her favorite treats was Vermont maple mousse, a light, creamy dessert that captured the pure sweetness of her home state. Maple syrup had long been a symbol of New England tradition, and in the 1920s, it was a luxurious but natural way to sweeten desserts. While Calvin Coolidge may have been known as Silent Cal, Grace made sure their dinner table and dessert always spoke for itself. Lou Hoover was anything but conventional. The First Lady to deliver a national radio address, she spoke multiple languages and even rode horseback through China during her travels. Her tastes in food were just as refined. She favored sweetbreads, a delicacy made from the thymus or pancreas of young calves. A European-inspired dish, it was often served at formal White House dinners, reflecting her appreciation for elegant, sophisticated cuisine. While the Great Depression cast a shadow over her husband's presidency, Lou remained a gracious hostess. Eleanor Roosevelt was a trailblazer, redefining the role of First Lady with her activism, public speaking, and tireless advocacy for human rights. But when it came to food, her preferences were surprisingly simple. Hasty pudding, also known as Indian pudding, was a longtime favorite. This colonial-era dish, made from cornmeal, molasses, and spices, was a staple of early American cooking. It reflected Eleanor's practical, no-nonsense approach to life. While White House guests often complained about the bland menus during her time, Eleanor herself never seemed to mind. Politics was complicated enough. At least dessert could be as straightforward as history itself. Bess Truman preferred a quiet life, avoiding the spotlight whenever possible. But she was a steady force behind Harry Truman's presidency. A proud Missourian, she had a taste for the region's homey, unfussy desserts, like Ozark pudding. Despite its name, this dish isn't a traditional pudding but a gooey, nut-filled apple dessert with a crisp top. It was a reflection of the Midwest, simple, practical, and surprisingly rich in flavor. While Bess wasn't one for public speeches or social events, she made sure the White House felt like home. And nothing says comfort like a warm slice of Ozark pudding. Mamie Eisenhower had a sweet tooth, and she made no secret of it. Known for her signature bangs, love of pink, and impeccable hosting skills, she brought warmth and charm to the White House. But her most famous contribution was Million Dollar Fudge. Rich, chocolatey, and packed with marshmallow creme, it was a favorite treat that even found its way into White House cookbooks. The name alone gave it prestige, but its popularity came from its irresistibly smooth texture. While her husband was commanding the post-war world stage, Mamie was making sure dessert was never an afterthought, at least not in her White House. Jacqueline Kennedy redefined the role of First Lady, bringing elegance, culture, and sophistication to the White House. Her refined taste extended to food, and one of her favorite dishes was poached salmon. A light yet luxurious meal, it reflected her love of French cuisine, which she embraced during her years studying abroad. Salmon had long been a symbol of fine dining, and in the Kennedy White House, every meal was carefully curated. While the world admired her style and grace, she was just as intentional about what was served at the table. Lady Bird Johnson was all about Southern hospitality, from her Texas roots to her White House initiatives. She championed beautification projects across America, but when it came to food, she kept things classic, like spoon bread. A softer, custard-like version of cornbread, this dish had deep roots in Southern and Native American cooking. Served warm with butter, it was a comforting staple at family meals. While her husband tackled the complexities of the Great Society, Lady Bird made sure the White House table reflected simple, hearty traditions. Pat Nixon was the embodiment of practicality, known for her dedication to volunteerism and making the White House more accessible to everyday Americans. Her favorite dish was meatloaf, a meal as classic and no-nonsense as she was. A staple of mid-century American dinners, meatloaf was budget-friendly, easy to prepare, and endlessly adaptable. During a time of political turbulence, Pat focused on creating a sense of normalcy, both in her public service and at the dinner table. While her husband navigated the complexities of global diplomacy, she stuck with a dish that had one simple mission: bring people together, one slice at a time. Betty Ford was a first lady unlike any before her, candid, outspoken, and unafraid to tackle tough issues. But when it came to food, she had a favorite with a little spice: Chinese pepper steak. A flavorful dish of thinly sliced beef stir-fried with bell peppers and soy sauce, it reflected the growing influence of international cuisine in American homes during the 1970s. Betty, known for embracing change, appreciated meals that were bold yet comforting. While her honesty and advocacy reshaped the role of First Lady at the dinner table, she kept things simple, proving that sometimes a little pepper goes a long way. Rosalind Carter brought a quiet determination to the White House, advocating for mental health awareness and humanitarian efforts. But when it came to desserts, she had a favorite that was pure Southern charm: strawberry cake. A beloved classic in Georgia, where she was born and raised, this moist, berry-filled cake was a staple at family gatherings. Strawberries symbolized warmth and hospitality, two qualities Rosalind embodied throughout her public service. While she tackled serious national issues, she still appreciated life's sweeter moments. And in a world of political ups and downs, at least a good slice of strawberry cake was never a bad idea. Nancy Reagan was known for her elegance, devotion to her husband, and of course her Just Say No campaign. But when it came to dessert, she happily said yes, especially to pumpkin pecan pie. A blend of two American classics, this rich spiced dessert reflected both tradition and indulgence, much like the glamour of the Reagan White House. The combination of creamy pumpkin filling and crunchy pecans made it a holiday favorite, and Nancy often shared her love for festive treats. While she worked to keep the nation's youth away from bad habits, she certainly wasn't turning down a good slice of pie. Barbara Bush was America's grandmother, warm, no-nonsense, and always dependable. And what could be more fitting than her love for chocolate chip cookies? A timeless classic, these cookies were a staple in American households, much like Barbara herself. She even entered the political cookie wars, a light-hearted tradition where first ladies shared their best recipes. Her version was simple but beloved, proving that sometimes the best things in life don't need an upgrade. While her husband managed global affairs, Barbara focused on literacy, family, and making sure a good batch of cookies was always within reach. Hillary Clinton redefined the role of First Lady, balancing policy, diplomacy, and a future political career of her own. But when it came to food, she had a taste for something refined: pecan-crusted lamb with morel sauce. A dish that blends Southern ingredients with French-inspired technique, it reflected both her Arkansas ties and her time hosting elegant White House dinners. Morel mushrooms, prized for their earthy flavor, gave the dish a touch of luxury. While politics was often unpredictable, this meal was anything but, It was rich, sophisticated, and perfectly balanced. Much like Hillary herself, it made a lasting impression. Laura Bush brought a quiet steadiness to the White House, known for her warmth, advocacy for education, and Texas charm. But when it came to dessert, she had a soft spot for something sweet and elegant: coconut cake. Light, fluffy, and topped with creamy frosting, it was a favorite for special occasions. Coconut cakes have long been a symbol of Southern hospitality, a fitting choice for a First Lady who prided herself on making guests feel welcome. While the political climate could be divisive, Laura knew one universal truth: when there's cake on the table, people are always a little happier. Michelle Obama transformed the role of First Lady, advocating for healthy eating and fitness with her Let's Move initiative. But even she had her guilty pleasures: pizza and fries. A self-proclaimed fan of classic comfort food, she often joked about balancing nutritious meals with the occasional indulgence. Pizza, a universal favorite, and crispy fries were reminders of her Chicago roots and love for casual, family-friendly dining. While she encouraged Americans to eat more greens, she also believed in moderation. After all, even the First Lady knew that sometimes the best thing on your plate isn't a salad, it's a slice. Melania Trump brought an international flair to the White House, being only the second First Lady born outside the U.S. While her Slovenian heritage influenced her tastes, one of her favorite dishes was a true Italian-American classic: chicken parmigiano. Crispy, breaded chicken smothered in marinara and melted cheese, it's a comfort food with a touch of elegance, much like Melania's public image. Italian cuisine has long been a staple of American dining, making this choice both familiar and refined. While her tenure was marked by a reserved public presence, her love for this hearty dish showed that some favorites need no introduction. Jill Biden has always balanced a busy life, teaching, advocating for military families, and serving as First Lady. But no matter how packed her schedule is, there's always time for something sweet. Oatmeal cookies are one of her favorites, a classic treat that's both wholesome and nostalgic. Packed with oats, sometimes raisins or chocolate chips, they're a perfect mix of hearty and indulgent, kind of like balancing work and family. As a grandmother, she's known for baking them for her grandkids, proving that even in the White House, a warm batch of cookies can make any place feel like home. John Quincy Adams never ever could tolerate mushrooms. He had them taken out of everything: his pizza, his burgers, his curry, his steak. You get the picture by now, surely. No aspect of the otherwise famous topping seemed to interest him, not the smoky and earthy flavors we have come to love, or the chewy texture. Guess they were never something that fit his idea of a good accessory to a dish. Zachary Taylor was more or less cut from the same cloth, direct in his leadership and even more blunt and plain with his food. Wherever he went, he had the simple tastes of a boy raised in the southern countryside. He typically had cornbread at whichever tavern he went to and loved steakhouses that were popular. It seems John Tyler would manage the stress that came with the job of president with a heaping helping of chess pies. Most people would mistake this for a pudding, but to the careful Southern eye, it would be obvious that what you were looking at was a chess pie. Deeply aromatic and incredibly flavorful, it was a dish that recharged the brain immediately. Dwight D. Eisenhower knew good food. A skilled cook himself, he often took charge of preparing his own meals, favoring hearty, all-American dishes like stews and steaks. But not everything on his White House menu was so universally appealing. One of the more unusual dishes served during his presidency? Cold, jellied consommé, a delicacy that today might raise a few eyebrows. A holdover from classic French cuisine, jellied consommé was essentially a clear beef broth thickened into a gelatinous form and served chilled. It was a dish that had been popular in fine dining for centuries, particularly in European aristocracy. The White House kitchen, trained in international culinary traditions, prepared it with precision, ensuring the broth was filtered multiple times for clarity and set with just the right consistency. Eisenhower, a man who had commanded Allied forces in World War II, certainly wasn't afraid of bold flavors. But in the post-war boom of the 1950s, America was embracing convenience foods, TV dinners, and casseroles, leaving dishes like jellied consommé behind. While elegant, it never quite won over the general public. And let's be honest, when given the choice between a bowl of cold meat jelly or a hot meal fresh off the grill, even a five-star general might choose the latter. James Madison seems to take after Jefferson's choice in palate and spice level, as he also did not like spicy food too much. Funnily enough, he was not one for seasoning either. While some presidents like Harding seemed to enjoy every opportunity to bump up the seasoning, Madison liked his food on the plainer side of things. William Henry Harrison was a big fan of this homely place called the Log Cabin Inn down in North Bend, Ohio. This inn happened to be one that his family came to own, which naturally became a part of his estate. Having a whole inn as a part of your property is quite the convenience, after all. Even in the taste buds of our presidents, the influence of English cooking is clear, and Millard Fillmore's love of the resurrection pie is a testament to that. The dish was first invented somewhere in northern England, but it quickly made its way into most cookbooks in the States, and eventually, it found its way to the president's table. Really humble beginnings for such a grand-sounding dish, but there was nothing humble about that delicious flavor. Harry Truman never forgot where he came from. Raised in Missouri, he had the no-nonsense attitude of a Midwesterner, and that extended to his meals. He wasn't one for fancy French sauces or elaborate presentations. He wanted hearty, straightforward food, and few things fit that description better than Ozark bacon-wrapped quail. Quail was a natural choice for someone from rural Missouri. The small game bird had long been a favorite in the region, hunted in the rolling Ozark Hills and prepared in the simplest, most effective way, wrapped in bacon and roasted until tender. The White House kitchen, always adapting to each president's tastes, prepared it just as Truman liked: uncomplicated, flavorful, and filling. Truman's presidency followed World War II, and while the economy was rebounding, food rationing had only recently ended. Americans were shifting back to enjoying meat-rich meals, and bacon-wrapped quail was a return to pre-war comforts. Unlike the European-influenced dishes served under Roosevelt, Truman's White House menu reflected traditional American flavors: bold, rustic, and undeniably satisfying. Lyndon B. Johnson could not really stomach liver. Something in his gut and sides told him that this dish just is not meant for him. Maybe listening to it is what helped him stay as healthy as he did, but he never even gave it the odd opportunity to prove itself. Though many tried to get him to see the appeal of liver, Johnson was one man who would not budge on his food opinions. His love for hearty, simple meals, and he often ordered multiple steaks in one sitting. Martin Van Buren loved going to places with good seafood, honoring his Dutch background with a good oyster. Oysters and various other kinds of seafood were common parts of Dutch culture back then, and despite growing up in Kinderhook in New York, he still tried various parts of the cuisine. He had a great love for fine dining and grand table. Richard Nixon, on the other hand, preferred to keep things light and smooth with some cottage cheese. Definitely way better for your long-term gut health than constant barbecue. While it obviously did not offer the same explosive flavors of a typical cookout, Richard Nixon never seemed to mind, as the president routinely had these for lunch. Plus, an ode made for Nixon and his wife even makes a reference to his long. Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency was defined by crisis management. First the Great Depression, then World War II. But when it came to food, FDR had an appreciation for the finer things in life. He loved rich, indulgent meals and wasn't afraid to enjoy international flavors. One of the more unexpected dishes to make its way onto the White House menu was fried almond cakes, a delicate golden treat with a crisp exterior and a soft, nutty center. The dish had European roots, reminiscent of French and Dutch almond pastries, but it wasn't overly extravagant. The White House kitchen, led by chefs skilled in balancing both frugality and elegance, prepared these cakes by frying an almond-based batter, sometimes dusted with sugar. The result was a dessert that felt luxurious without being wasteful, something that fit Roosevelt's philosophy well. By the time FDR took office in 1933, the country was still reeling from economic collapse, and food rationing loomed on the horizon. While White House meals remained relatively modest, Roosevelt believed in keeping morale high. Treats like fried almond cakes offered a taste of normalcy in turbulent times. John Adams, on the other hand, never liked tea. We can kind of see that, and we would say it is not every American's cup of, well, you know how the saying goes. John Adams always preferred a classic black coffee or a glass of whiskey as his beverage of choice. The appeal of tea and toast and all the subculture surrounding it was a little lost on him. Franklin Pierce was also a fan of New England cuisine, especially things like fried clam. He loved visiting coastal areas like Maine and Rhode Island. Most of the presidents of the early era of the American presidency did not have many favorite places they would go to, because the restaurant industry was not half as developed. They still had areas where they frequented to get their preferences met. While the presidency of the United States of America has been a dark topic at some times, with conspiracies and assassinations everywhere you look, Zachary Taylor is probably the one president who made his bed and went to lie in it too. Zachary was an incredibly passionate enjoyer of Kalas thou shods. If you are wondering what that is, these are fried sweet rice dumplings that had a surprisingly high level of cholesterol, especially with the amount he consumed. By the time Woodrow Wilson took office in 1913, America was changing rapidly. Industrialization was reshaping the economy, immigration was influencing cuisine, and soon World War I would push the nation into food conservation efforts. Yet, despite the global events unfolding around him, Wilson's food preferences remained rooted in the traditions of his Southern upbringing. Among the humbler dishes that found their way onto his table was scrapple, a dish as resourceful as it was controversial. Scrapple was a Pennsylvania Dutch creation made from pork scraps, cornmeal, and spices, all molded into a loaf and pan-fried until crisp. It wasn't elegant, but it was practical, a way to use every last bit of an animal with nothing going to waste. The White House kitchen, accustomed to more refined European-inspired dishes, had to adapt. This was working-class food, and it reflected Wilson's taste for simplicity. But wartime had a way of making necessity fashionable. With food shortages and rationing during the Great War, the government encouraged Americans to embrace frugal meals. Suddenly, dishes like scrapple, cheap, filling, and efficient, weren't just for the Pennsylvania Dutch. They were patriotic. George Washington deeply disliked turnips and was always found turning them away, despite his staff urging him to include some in his diet. Turnips are pretty well regarded for what they can do for your health, and you would think that fact would not be lost on one in as esteemed of a position as the president. Unfortunately, it seems the cons of the taste override the pros of the body in this case, and for all his wisdom and political expertise, Washington could not convince himself to down one. John Tyler loved anywhere you could find good spring chicken, woodcock, or ham and eggs. He had some pretty Virginian tastes, and that is what was trending in the state during the time he was president in the 1840s. William Henry Harrison, on the other hand, was a bit more fond of lighter and protein-packed dishes like squirrel stew, which now would not pass at any table, but back in the 1890s was considered a dish worthy of the highest table in the country. In fact, the man loved his squirrels so much that he would hand out free stew at rallies and voter gatherings all across the nation as part of his campaign efforts. Talk about building goodwill. Herbert Hoover entered the White House in 1929 with a reputation as a self-made man, an engineer, a humanitarian, and someone who believed in hard work over indulgence. But before the Great Depression defined his presidency, the White House still reflected the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties. Among the dishes served at state dinners was something that might seem extravagant today: baked ham with champagne sauce. Ham was nothing unusual. It was a staple of American kitchens, particularly in the Midwest, where Hoover was raised. But the addition of champagne sauce? That was a nod to European influence, something Hoover had acquired during his years living abroad as a mining engineer. The White House kitchen, staffed with chefs skilled in both American and European techniques, prepared the dish with a reduction of champagne, mustard, and brown sugar, elevating a common protein into something refined. Then, the stock market crashed. By 1930, millions were unemployed, and prosperity around the corner became an empty promise. Lavish meals quickly fell out of favor. Hoover, who had once overseen massive relief efforts during World War I, now faced a country where food lines stretched for blocks. The The White House menu, like the nation itself, adapted simpler meals, fewer indulgences. Harry S. Truman and mayonnaise are one infamous combo that never paired up properly. He would make expressive requests to the staff to ensure that mayo was out of any kind of fast food he ordered, and when he was the president, the White House had pretty low stocks of the topping too. Maybe he just did not like dips in general. Martin Van Oren never seemed to, and you could not ever place him and a bottle at the same scene. Despite having a French cook and a basement filled with French wine, Andrew Jackson was always found visiting the many places in Nashville where you could catch a good bite to eat. From things like chicken sandwiches to steaks, he was often at any tavern or inn with good grub. Jackson's fiery personality matched his love for hearty, simple meals, and he often ordered multiple steaks in one sitting. John Quincy Adams, on the other hand, was probably the healthiest president of his time, as he was both a fanatic gardener and someone who really enjoyed the fruits of his labor. In his case, we mean that quite literally, as his favorite food was just a collection of fruits he would regularly grow in his garden, the best of which he claimed were his plums, apples, and peaches. Gerald Ford took office in the wake of scandal, promising stability and a return to normalcy. His food choices reflected the same attitude: simple, Midwestern, and no nonsense. Unlike some of his predecessors who indulged in elaborate meals, Ford preferred straightforward, comforting dishes. One of the more unique items on his table? Caraway seed rolls, a nod to his Dutch-American heritage and a favorite at the Ford family dinner table. The White House kitchen was used to accommodating presidential preferences, and Ford's taste leaned toward the hearty and familiar. Caraway seeds, often found in European baking, gave the rolls an earthy, slightly peppery flavor. Though rooted in the Midwest, the dish carried an international influence, tracing back to German, Dutch, and Eastern European traditions. Ford's presidency wasn't an easy one. He inherited an economy struggling with inflation and the lingering effects of the 1973 oil crisis. While American households were tightening their budgets, the White House also shifted toward modest, practical meals. Fancy French pastries might have been served in other administrations, but Ford's kitchen stuck to wholesome, homemade bread. James K. Polk never seemed to like spicy food that much either. Maybe this is some kind of trend within presidents? We will definitely have to keep an eye out as we go on with the list. Do you think the cuisine they serve at the White House daily makes somebody averse to spices, or lowers their tolerance pretty significantly? Maybe it was just a thing with a select few candidates. Either way, we can add James K. Polk to the growing club of U.S. presidents that did not like it hot. Millard Fillmore liked anywhere with good New England cuisine, and one of the places that had a good knack for it was the Willard Hotel. That place opened up during the time he was president, and it became a hub for influential people to eat and rub shoulders at. In particular, he loved places with a goof-clear soup. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of America, brought an air of sophistication, with his favorite food being a tenderloin with Jezebel sauce. The addition of Jezebel sauce really sets this dish apart because the pairing of meat with a sweet sauce made with apples, pineapples, and pepper was a rare recipe. Maybe Andrew Jackson was onto something with this dish. Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer before he was president, and his Southern roots shaped everything from his leadership style to his plate. While the White House had seen its fair share of elegant meals, Carter preferred simple, home-cooked dishes, the kind you'd find at a Georgia church potluck. And few things represented that better than Brunswick stew. A Southern classic, Brunswick stew is a thick, tomato-based dish loaded with slow-cooked meats, traditionally rabbit or squirrel, but in Carter's White House, chicken and pork were more common. It was a working man's meal, originally cooked in massive iron pots to feed crowds. The White House kitchen, accustomed to preparing sophisticated entrees, had to embrace a more rustic style. No imported ingredients, no elaborate presentation, just good, honest food. Carter's presidency came at a time of economic difficulty, with inflation and an energy crisis straining American households. The message of self-reliance and frugality resonated, and Brunswick stew fit the moment, a dish built from scraps, designed to stretch a meal as far as possible. Unlike the refined European influences of previous administrations, Carter's White House menu stayed close to home. In contrast, James Monroe was never a fan of seafood. One specific thing he could not stand over all others was oysters, and we cannot see where he was coming from. Everyone has their preferences, picks, and choices. But why oysters? You can do so much with them, and they have been a delight of portside towns across the nation since who knows how long. James K. Polk was a pretty simple and straightforward president. He didn't spend much of his free time on exploring the cuisine of the country, though when he did eat, it was out in New Orleans where he could find Creole cooking and French delicacies. At the end of the day, though, Polk preferred steak and ham and stuck to a traditional Southern diet. Dwight Eisenhower particularly preferred beef stew over all else, especially one that had been left to stew for 1,000,000 years, mixed with the freshest vegetables in all of America. The experience was kind of like the ending scene in Ratatouille. He also had a strong penchant for tomato broths, and it sounds like Lyndon B. Johnson was a Texan through and through, and his tastes reflected it. He didn't care for fancy, elaborate meals. If it wasn't Southern, hearty, and made with simple ingredients, he wasn't interested. And when it came to dessert, one of his favorites was buttermilk pie, a rich, custard-like treat that had been a staple in the South for generations. Unlike some presidential desserts that required imported chocolates or delicate pastry work, buttermilk pie was built on practicality. The White House kitchen, used to preparing grand state dinners, had no trouble whipping up this simple mix of eggs, sugar, butter, and tangy buttermilk. No expensive ingredients, no unnecessary flourishes, just old-fashioned goodness. Johnson's presidency came at a time of major economic and political shifts, with the Vietnam War draining national resources. While the country debated policy, the food in the White House remained grounded in Johnson's Texan roots. Even when he dined with foreign leaders, he preferred serving Southern classics rather than bending to European fine dining traditions. John Tyler also agreed with Harrison's take on this aspect, but he had a healthy layer to this mindset that he applied to his eating habits pretty often. John Tyler would never tolerate overly greasy foods or rich foods for a variety of reasons. The bloating, the suffocating feeling afterwards, the digestion issues. It seems there is a lot about heavy food that Tyler could not stand. By the time James Monroe took office in 1817, American cuisine was still deeply tied to its colonial past. But in Monroe's White House, the kitchen reflected a growing national identity, one that blended European traditions with Southern agricultural staples. He had spent years as a diplomat in France and Britain, developing a taste for refined pastries and delicate breads. Yet, when it came to the White House menu, the president's roots in Virginia took center stage. Sweet potatoes had long been a Southern favorite, prized for their natural sweetness and versatility. Unlike the delicate croissants Monroe had encountered abroad, these biscuits were sturdy, practical, and deeply American. The recipe itself was simple: sweet potatoes mashed into the dough, creating a softer texture and a hint of caramelized flavor. Monroe's presidency came at a time of economic recovery following the War of 1812, and thrift was the order of the day. The White House kitchen, though well-staffed, had to balance refinement with resourcefulness. Sweet potato biscuits fit the bill: affordable, nourishing, and distinctly Southern. Zachary Taylor, in a pretty contrasting way, could not tolerate cucumbers at all. You would think he would be okay with having one on a sandwich every now and then, but even that was beneath the man. We do not know what his beef with cucumbers was or where it started from. Maybe it happened on a bad day in his childhood where a cucumber was the straw that broke the camel's back. But what we do know is that his distaste was strong. By the time Benjamin Harrison took office in 1889, the White House menu reflected a country caught between tradition and modernization. Railroads had expanded access to food nationwide, but Harrison, like many men of his era, still preferred the hearty frontier-style meals of his Midwestern upbringing. Among his favorite dishes was something that might raise a few eyebrows today: squirrel stew. Squirrel was not an unusual choice in the late 19th century. For many rural Americans, it was simply a practical source of protein, abundant, easy to hunt, and, according to some, surprisingly tasty. Harrison, raised in Indiana, had grown up on rustic meals like this, and despite his status as president, he saw no reason to abandon them. The White House kitchen, staffed by skilled but uncelebrated cooks, prepared the dish the old-fashioned way, slow-simmered with root vegetables and thickened into a rich, gamey broth. But while the White House dined comfortably, the country wasn't so fortunate. The Panic of 1893, one of the worst economic downturns of the era, was looming just beyond Harrison's presidency. As times got tougher, many Americans turned to the same kind of resourceful cooking that had defined Harrison's childhood. Anything that was overly fancy or complicated was something Andrew Jackson was not stomaching or tolerating on his plate. In particular, he never seemed to like European cuisine. The White House was pretty renowned for serving this type of food in particular. If you ever asked him, he would much prefer simple stuff like steak and eggs. Thomas Jefferson may be best remembered for drafting the Declaration of Independence, but his influence on American cuisine was just as revolutionary. A man of refined tastes, he brought back culinary inspiration from his time in France, filling the White House with dishes far more sophisticated than the heavy meats and boiled vegetables common in early America. Yet, despite his love of European flavors, one of his favorite foods remained something far simpler: peas. At Monticello, his Virginia estate, Jefferson meticulously documented his gardening experiments, growing dozens of pea varieties. He even turned it into a competition with his neighbors. Whoever harvested the first crop of the season would host a dinner featuring the fresh-picked peas. The White House kitchen carried on this obsession, preparing them in ways inspired by both American and French traditions. Some were served simply, buttered and lightly seasoned, while others were pureed into elegant side dishes. Jefferson's presidency coincided with economic instability following the Napoleonic Wars, making domestic food production more important than ever. Peas may not have been the flashiest dish to grace the White House table, but for Jefferson, they were a symbol of self-sufficiency. And perhaps a small victory in his never-ending gardening contest. Richard Nixon is one of those "I eat for sustenance, not enjoyment" type of people. Reason being, he hated cottage cheese with somewhat of a seething passion, but ate it anyway with ketchup because of the health benefits. His favorite thing to have was ham mousse, but God forbid somebody give him some cheese that he did not plan to include in his meal. Calvin Coolidge wasn't a man of extravagance. A Vermonter through and through, he preferred plain food, quiet dinners, and the kind of frugality that made even his White House kitchen staff take notice. While other presidents dined on fine cuts of meat and elaborate French pastries, Coolidge had an unexpected favorite: pickles. And not just any pickles. He specifically favored the sharp, tangy, home-brined varieties from his home state of Vermont. By the 1920s, the White House had access to an increasing variety of imported foods, yet Coolidge rarely indulged. His presidency followed the economic boom of World War I, but he remained cautious, believing in modest living even at the height of prosperity. His White House kitchen reflected that philosophy, serving simple, farm-style meals. And when it came to pickles, they had to be homemade, preferably the kind that had been brined for weeks in vinegar, salt, and spices. Pickling was a necessity in the days before widespread refrigeration, and even the most well-stocked homes relied on preserved vegetables to last through harsh winter. Dwight D. Eisenhower could not see the hype behind garlic. This is one that we think might be a sign of a real issue, since we cannot imagine a functioning adult not seeing the wonders of garlic bread. Not just bread, he would not have anything with garlic in it. It was never an ingredient in the things he would ask for from the chefs. John F. Kennedy is one of the most memorable presidents in the history of the nation. But what people may not know is that a bowl of New England fish chowder outshone everything else for him. He always loved potatoes to boot, so his recipe included diced bits of it. A pretty handy dish if seafood is what gets you going. Barbecue is something that resonates as strongly with Americans as 2000s pop, and that really extends to all levels of society, including presidential. Lyndon B. Johnson, despite being a pretty picky eater, would never deny some beef or pork barbecued properly on a hot grill. She even invited a chef known as the Barbecue King from Texas to make the finest barbecue ever known to an American. John F. Kennedy seemed to dislike happiness itself, since if you served him mashed potatoes, he would get an ick. Why would that happen to a person? Who dislikes mashed potatoes? Is it something he has always not had, or was it a recently developed opinion? One can never know. But if we could ever meet the man, this would be on the top of our questions list, even beating the controversies and scandals surrounding him. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and tell us which First Lady's favorite meal would you like to try.